It's Tuesday afternoon, 4 p.m. in Central Europe, and it's time for our very first Space Café Israel with Meidad Pariente and his guest, Tal Inbar. As always, we really appreciate your participation and ongoing feedback, and we constantly learn and improve based on the feedback you give us. My name is Chiara Monter. I'm the event coordinator at SpaceWatch.Global. SpaceWatch.Global is a Europe-based online platform for information in and about space and new space activities in a geopolitical context. And I would like to take this moment to thank all of our private and corporate supporters that have showed their commitment to keeping our independent journalism alive. We really appreciate that. Now, I know many of you are already familiar with our website, our bi-weekly and daily newsletters, and the Space Café podcasts. Our latest episode features Eric Wonderquist, the man behind the space video hit Wanderers on YouTube. And we also have new exciting episodes in our Space Café radio from all the conferences we've been to over the summer. The latest one is with Hugo André Costa from Portugal Space, so don't miss it. And we also have a fan shop online open for you to support us actively. And it's a nice way for you to become a space watcher, so check it out. Now, if you've missed any of our previous web talks, we have an archive available on our webpage in the events section and also on our YouTube channel. And we will host our Space Café Israel live on a regular basis. With that, my job is done, and I'd like to hand over to your host for today. Meidad, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Our guest for the first Space Café Israel is the one and only legend, Mr. Tal Inbar, human Wikipedia, regarding everything related to space. And we will talk today about whether Israel can become also the space nation, not only the startup nation. And Tal, my first question to you is, can you share with us, how did you become such an authority on the history of space in general and the Israeli space industry, especially as I know it, you are not part of the Israeli Air Force, so please.
Well, as you know, when I was the head of the Space Research Center at the Fisher Institute, our director was an ex-Israeli Air Force general, and our chairman was an ex-Israeli Air Force commander. So he always treated me as, oh, you represent the targets, because I was a tank commander at the time. So it has nothing related to my previous years in the military, which was the regular service. Actually, I started to be very interested in space relatively at an old age of about 4.5 or 5 years old. So I went to many courses, and I built my own first telescope when I was about 9 years old. And I started to launch rockets by the age of 11. And then it was only natural for me to learn everything that I can about what Israel is doing in space, which was very little at the time, but also what NASA did. So I started to write letters to NASA and ask for information. And I have many booklets and pictures. And it wasn't strange for me as a 10 years old boy from Israel, the Middle East, that I got materials, of course, free from NASA. And then it was obvious to me what was the reason, because you cannot understand and anticipate anything that a child might do with the right attitude to information. And I was fortunate.
It is regular mail we're talking about.
Regular mail, and I
used stamps and everything.
I used a typewriter and a dictionary.
Wow.
And years after those letters, I was able to tell the story in person to the then NASA administrator, Charlie Bolden. And he is a four-star Marines general. and 4-time veteran of space missions, a very tough guy. And he started to, doing something like this. And he told me, well, now you can understand. So this is the lesson for me. I'm always telling colleagues and co-workers that if I'm not available immediately, it is because I'm answering a child with some questions about space. So then I approached the Israeli Space Agency from, let's say, when I was 20-something years old. And the director general at the time, it was the late Abi Har-Evan, and I told him, at the time, the Israeli Space Agency was consisted of one director general, one secretary. Not always. It was sometimes half of the time, and the chairman. And I told him, well, I considered me as an employee of the Israeli Space Agency with no salary. And at the time, I had a huge collection of information from companies all over the world. It was before the internet, and a lot of videotapes before YouTube. So anytime he needed something, information about space, he approached me. And today it's a little bit funny for me to dig into the Israeli state archives about the Israeli Space Agency, and sometimes I find letters that I wrote in the late 1980s, mid 1990s. So I have my mark. And then I like history in general, and space history in particular. And I'm a member of the International Academy of Astronautics History Committee. So I started to write academic papers about the history of the Israeli space story, technical history, and the history of prominent people in it. So all those articles are available, and they are published regularly in books. I can say that I'm the only space historian in Israel writing about the space history of Israel, because I'm the only one. So
being a space historian, let's dive right in. Can you share with us an anecdote or something that it is not public knowledge yet, and it will be the first time ever in this Space Cafe that people will hear about it?
Yeah, well, I have a lot of stories, a lot of space gossip, if you will, but I can tell you something about the history of the first Israeli astronaut in space, the late Ilan Ramon.
Yeah.
And many people in the world think that, well, an Israeli astronaut is just a natural cause of events in the framework of the Israeli space effort and so on. And this is not the case. So I have the personal notes of Ilan Ramon, handwritten, and I have the personal accounts of Abi Har-Evan, who was the Director General at the time. And I spoke to many people that were in the room on record. So it was very interesting to see the development of the story, because Israeli then Prime Minister Shimon Peres went to Washington, D.C. to meet President Clinton. And when they left the Oval Office, just as a corridor talk and chat, Peres asked, well, why don't you put an Israeli astronaut in space? So Clinton said, okay, I will check it. And immediately it went into the Israeli media. And then I have the letter from the Director General of the Israeli Space Agency, and he wrote a letter to the Minister of Science and Technology saying, what this is all about? We don't have the money, and I suggest to kill the project immediately. Wow. Because lack of funds. So later, I have the letters between the Israeli Space Agency and the Ministry of Defense. So the Ministry of Defense said, don't worry, we will pay for the experiment. And the Israeli Air Force said, don't worry, we will pay for the astronaut. And the deadline for the signing between the Israeli Space Agency and NASA about sending training and sending an Israeli astronaut was December 31st. On December 30, the Space Agency got the 2 letters from the Air Force and from the Ministry of Defense. Let's say not. It was not a contract between them, but they said it will be okay. So count on us. It will be okay. The Israeli way. So on the last day possible, Israel and NASA signed the agreement, and that was the starting point of the Israeli astronaut project. Something that was like a PR for the Prime Minister, and then it became a national project. And unfortunately, it ended in the Columbia accident at the end.
Oh, interesting. Tal, how do you see the role of women in the Israeli space industry and in overall in the space related industry here in the country?
Well, this is the type of question that I don't like to hear or to answer, because it's now 2022. I think to speak about the gender of people that are involved in space activities is just not something that shouldn't be done anymore. I don't think that there is a fundamental difference between a female space engineer or an astronaut or so on. I see a lot of women in the Israeli space arena, more in the, let's say, traditional space sector, like the Israeli aerospace industries, as you, of course, can recollect on a personal basis. And if you are talking about the Israeli Space Agency, it is something that related to the Israeli Ministry of Innovation, Science and Technology, and there is a female minister and a female director general, and most of the advisors are not men. So you can see a lot. I don't think that there is something inherent that can deter women to embark on a scientific career, and space is no different, because we all know that there are some differences between men and women, and the education system can cope with some of those challenges, obstacles, STEM education, and so on. But I don't think that there is something against women in the Israeli space sector, and I see a lot. I saw much more female space engineers and scientists in the UAE, for example, because in the UAE, this is a goal of the government to have at least 40 to 50% women in the field. And they are coming close to this goal. I don't aware of anything like this here in Israel. So it's on a personal basis. Okay. I like to see good people, regardless of the gender.
The question was because the history of the space industry in Israel started as a defense need, and this is why I asked. Did Israel have a large-scale space program that was aborted?
Well, I cannot reveal anything. I can recall, for example, there was a project to build. By the way, we are several minutes before the revelations of another set of pictures from the James Webb Space Telescope. There was a project in Israel, an official project by the Israeli Space Agency back in the 1990s to build an ultraviolet space telescope. At the beginning, TAUVEX. At the beginning, it was supposed to be an independent satellite containing 3 telescopes in the UV. And then it was too costly for the Ministry of Science. So we decided to build just the telescopes and find someone else to attach the telescope to another satellite. And a satellite was found. It was a joint Danish-Soviet mission. So you can understand how old this project was. And then the Soviet Union collapsed, and of course the large Soviet telescope never built. So the telescope, which was built already, was put in a storage at then Elop, now part of Elbit. And it has a second life because we found another partner, India. So it was supposed to be launched on board a geostationary communication satellite by India, from India. And at the end, days before the launch, the Indians took off the space telescope because of weight limitations on the launch vehicle. And then the launch vehicle exploded mid-air. So our telescope was saved, but then again, it never made it into space. And this, even though it is a small project in terms of dollars in the world, for us it was a big investment. And but we will see another Israeli ultraviolet space telescope not so far away, the Ultrasat, which is a modern, let's say, a modern version of a UV space telescope. So this was the biggest, I think, project that was abandoned. There were several other ideas that never materialized.
Interesting, very interesting. So being there from day one, how do you see the Israeli space industry today? What are your perception of the strength and the weaknesses? And especially, let's talk about, do we copy this startup nation model into the space industry?
Well, we have only 1 hour, I think, Meidad, but
Yes,
for this question, we need 2 at least. Well, we have a very good space industry. Both the traditional space, I don't like to use the term old space versus new space, but we have both. We can do a lot of things, but there are a lot of limitations. And for example, the governmental space sector, be it IAI or Rafael, are building satellites for the needs of Israel, basically for the needs of the Ministry of Defense. And it is not healthy for every company to rely almost solely on one customer with such a huge share of the revenues. So this is one limitation. Another one is regulation and international regimes like MTCR, ITAR, and so on, preventing us from exporting a lot of space-related hardware to other countries. Another issue is that there is lack of R&D money in the companies. Private company, of course, it's hard to get the funds from investors, but even a huge company like Rafael or IAI has a very small budget for internal R&D. And for example, you can understand that the situation is quite strange because the first satellite was built and launched by Israel in 1988. And since that day, many more went to space successfully. But there is no single satellite owned by the Israeli space industry. There's no satellite owned by IAI or Rafael, Elbit, and so on. So this is not such a healthy situation. And as for the startups, a lot of good ideas we can find in various companies. But again, the funding is an issue and regulation is an issue. So we will need something to solve several of the problems, like an Israeli space law. And at the current situation, we don't have a space law. And for many years, there are a lot of talking about it, and eventually we will have one. And for example, even a small school involved in a nanosatellite, and I see your smile because you know it, involved in a small satellite, which is a commercial off-the-shelf technology and so on, is forced to be treated as a weapon export, because this is the law in Israel. So it's a bureaucracy and regulations and other issues. And I think the best support that the government could give to space companies, especially the small ones, is not to interfere. It is not giving them budgets and money, but let us work. And we see the result. Many startups are registered not in Israel. There is an R&D center in Israel, but the company could be Swiss company, could be UK company, and so on.
Okay, so I'm going to challenge you now. If you would be asked to write the Israeli space policy, which we all know doesn't exist yet, what will be the main 3 things it will include?
Well, I think actually it's a very easy question for me to answer, because I have the plan here for many years. But we will need
it's already written.
Yeah, sure.
Of course.
We will need an Israeli space law.
Okay.
Lifting most of the limitations on the space sector, and the division should be not, it should be the purpose of a satellite, for example. If a satellite is meant to be an agricultural satellite, or something for the health of, let's say, plants, or to find water in the desert. So it's not military, because the end user are civilians and so on. So space law is needed. And we will need to be much more focused. I think the Israeli space industry and space agencies should be much more focused, and not to spread all the budget on so many efforts. We will need several vectors that could be something that we can sell. So if you want to speak about the space economics, it could be something of a technological breakthrough for the world, or international cooperation and collaboration in that regard. But you have to be focused. So if you want to do astronomy, do something very good in astronomy or astrophysics, or if you want to compete with Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk in the field of mega constellations or launch vehicles, okay. But you cannot do all the things at the time, and to skip from one to another, this is not such a good idea. And I think before the Israeli space law and before the focus, the most important thing, in my view, is to have an independent Israeli space agency, not as part of a governmental sector or ministry. So like the FAA in the US, like NASA, like NOAA, like many other agencies, such an independent authority, Israeli Space Agency as a statutory organ, could be much more powerful. And you know, the people from not from Israel, you might notice that we are going to have another election soon. And I have no recollection of a fight between the ministers over the Ministry of Science. It's a very important for us. It's a very important ministry, but it's not the most thought after from politicians' point of view. So an independent space agency focus and an Israeli space law, and then you can have the vision, and from the vision you can draw the action plans and the action items for sustainable, independent Israeli space policy.
Yeah, I share your points. What do you think, Tal, about the collaboration between Israel and its neighbors now that we have the Abraham Peace Accord? I was already thinking about the Space Accord.
Sure.
And do you think Israel should strengthen its space connections with its neighbors?
Well, as you know, the way of doing business with other countries in the field of space, because the Israeli Space Agency is a governmental organ, is to first sign an MOU with other country or other space agency. But an MOU is a very nice piece of paper, usually with either a red or a blue leather cover with gold inscription of the sign of the insignia of the country. But there is no money inside. So you have to find a way to finance. It could be a joint venture like we had it with France on the Venus, and you know Venus, of course. Yeah, a little bit. So, when I'm looking on the Middle East, for example, recently there was an MOU signed with UAE, with a small fraction of it dealing with space. But basically, it's just space application downstream, mostly images from the Venus satellites for the researchers in the UAE and the joint teams of researchers, for example. I want to do, and I want to see and do much more. I want to see joint Israeli Emirati space mission far from Earth. It could be to Venus, it could be to Mars, it could be to the asteroid belt.
Farming on Mars.
For example, I want to see cooperation with other countries, with Egypt and Jordan, and we can start in a small way, like a student satellite. You know, as in space, we have no borders between countries. So this is a manifestation of this cliche. You can build a small satellite in cooperation with other countries, with contributions of funds and technologies for the benefit of all. And I think that we have a long way to go, but this is something that I want to see. And I think, like I said before, we have to focus, but we have to diversify our efforts to find partners in different regions of the world. Not just going back to Europe, it could be Italy, it could be France, it could be Germany. And the next year, it could be Germany, Italy, and France, and so on. We have the Baltics, we have South America, Latin America, and we have many countries in Africa. And we could be together with, let's say, with UAE, we could be a hub for newcomers into space to build. And, you know, we spoke a little bit about it, and the Israeli Space Agency didn't took this project forward. So we can do much more with the human resources that we have here and the innovation spirit. And I think because the Israeli Space Agency is part of the government, you have to go through those channels, because it's very hard for, let's say, a startup in Israel to approach the equivalent in the UAE, or be it Saudi Arabia in a few years or a few months, I don't know. So this could be a very, very good idea. And I think, for example, that we might be also approach the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because this is a very good idea of not just exporting knowledge, but partnership. And we have the traditional partnership with other countries in the fields of agriculture, water, and so, but much less in space. So yes, there is a lot to do in the regional cooperation in space.
So I'm giving you the captain's hat again, and I would ask you to advise which countries that currently have no relationship for space projects in Israel with Israel you think Israel should approach and try to have some kind of a collaboration?
Well, actually, I cannot give you the full answer because I did something like this just recently for the Israeli Space Agency, a list of countries to approach. And on another hat, I'm advisor to several governmental industries, including IAI, in the fields of strategy for space. But I told you before, in civilian space, Latin America for sure, and there are tier 2 or 3 countries in the world. In Africa, we have nothing in Africa at the moment in space, and also Europe, parts of Europe, Central Europe, for example, the Czech Republic, Slovenia, Slovakia, Poland. I know that several visits were conducted from those countries to Israel during the years, but nothing concrete that I can put my finger at the moment.
What about the giant whose name will not mention specifically? What do you think about China?
Well, China, you know, in 2011, I brought a Chinese delegation.
To the Israeli Space Conference.
They were supposed to be at the conference, but there was a strike at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so no visas were issued at the time. But nevertheless, they came. And you remember the second delegation with the moon rover and so on. So at the time, I arranged a meeting between the Chinese delegation and the Israeli Space Agency, and with the Israeli president at the time, Shimon Peres. And a specific offer was put on the table by the Chinese. We can send an Israeli to space on board a Chinese spacecraft. At the time, China didn't have any manned orbital space station. So it was an offer. And it was 2011, and we are now in 2022, and no Israeli, as far as I know, was able to be trained by the Chinese authorities and sent into space. Because of, let's say, sensitivities between China and the United States, and we didn't want to take sides and so on. But nevertheless, I can tell you that I arranged a meeting between NASA administrator and a high official Chinese space expert during the Ilan Ramon Space Conference in Herzliya. And both parties were very happy about it. So I think China is a very powerful player in space. I don't see any official signing of documents and starting a project with China. By the way, it was not the case in the 1990s. Just today, I got another file, and you know it, from the Israeli State Archives, dated 1991. And there was on the table an MOU between Israel and China in the field of aerospace.
1991.
1991.
Wow.
but it was never materialized because there was an MOU between the two ministries of defense. And we all know that at the time, Israeli aerospace industries sold several systems to China. But the Chinese wanted to ink another MOU with the Israeli Space Agency, and I have all the official documents, and it is unclassified, and it was scanned by the archives. And you can
will you
read
upload them later to your media pages so people can see?
I might. I have to consider. I have to ask my lawyer. Yeah, sure. But it's in Hebrew. But nevertheless, it was not signed. So we are much more West-oriented country. This is the same case with Japan. A lot of visitors from the Israeli space sector went to Japan, and Japanese came to Israel and so on, but there's no cooperation in Japanese spacecraft, except, of course, for some components like the Ramon space chip in the computer of Hayabusa lander on an asteroid and so on. But this is not G to G. So then again, if the space agency will continue to be a part of a ministry within the government, you have a lot more restrictions, a lot more hesitation to sign and to embark on a cooperation with other countries because of the other political implications and the foreign, let's say, foreign relations of Israel. So an independent space agency would be much more free, in my belief, to embark on a very different way of cooperation.
Being a country that launches to the West, and as you mentioned now, it seems like we are looking only towards West regarding space. Do you think we lose as a country? Does Israel suffer from the fact it looks only to the West and not to East for collaborations?
I think so, but there are many factors that can be tracked as the core reason for this situation, and I don't see it changing in the foreseeable future. If you're speaking about China, for example. So we have to wait. But as you know, Israel is an old nation, like China. So in the future, I think that we might see a change of attitude in that regard, because we have a lot of other issues that the governments are cooperating and working together. So space is no different, and we have to just forget about the old definition of anything related to space is equal a weapon or something which is defense oriented.
So let's go back to civilian space. Can you name a few Israeli new space companies that you think the audience should be aware of, be familiar with their doing, and also mention why do you think that they have a good chance to succeed in the space world business?
Well, I will start with the second half of the question. I'm not sure at all that there will be successful companies, because even if you have a good idea and you of all people know it, it doesn't mean that you will be a successful entrepreneur and that you will be a serious player in the international space business. So it's a little bit unfair for me to state just a few names of companies, but I believe that in one of the upcoming space cafes from Israel, you will host several people from the startup scene in space. But We can talk about NSL.com, the small company that built a very sophisticated antenna, folded antennas for small satellites. And we can speak about your company, which will be unethical to do at the moment, but SAS, so we won't. We can speak about new ideas that you can find in the startups like a new propulsion, gel-based propulsion, like a new rocket. And of course, I mentioned Ramon Space, who is developing space computers, very, very good ones, designed specifically for space missions, not only Earth's rotating satellites, but also deep space missions. And we've proved performance. We can speak about other companies that are dealing with even launch vehicles in the long run. But you can see a lot of companies, small companies. Some of them are, we can call them upstream, much more downstream applications on Earth. For example, the company that we all know, Space Pharma. I'm used to tease the CEO from time to time, and I'm telling him, well, you are not a space company. So he said, how come? I said, well, if you will have, let's say, a room with microgravity inside, but the room will be on Earth, will you use it? Well, he said, of course. So I said, you are not space company. You are not interested in space per se, but you are interested in the conditions, in the unique environment of space. So in that regard, there are much more new ideas, something that is now becoming much more familiar. Helios, for example, they established a company to make oxygen from the moon rocks. But in the meantime, they are now producing iron on Earth. So you can never know what will be the end result of such a startup. And we have much more. And I know from the discussions with the current Director General of the Israeli Space Agency, he wanted to see many more companies, let's say in 10 years' time. I want to see slightly less companies, but much more successful and much more independent companies that can do space-related things here in Israel and sell abroad with minimum bureaucracy and obstacles.
Why do you think there is no Israeli hardware manufacturer for nanosatellites and new space like you have almost all over the world as spin-offs from universities?
This is a tough question. I think lack of vision from the industry.
Hardware is tough, so yeah.
But basically lack of vision from the industry years ago. I don't think that there is one good reason why most of the nanosatellites are built in the Netherlands or in Denmark and then exported all over the world. We could do it here with no problem. But I don't remember what was the year when we established the Association for Small Nanosatellites in Israel. It was
2006.
2006. So you see, you have a share. We share the same problem. Many times we are ahead of our times in something between 10 to 20 years. So when the industry is ready, when the space agency is ready, when the investors are ready, we already late. So now to produce nanosatellite in Israel as a product for export is not such a good idea to do, because we have no advantage. We can do the same quality, not the same price. We will be a slightly higher price. And the same applies to, let's say, small launch vehicles. In 20 2012, I conducted a research for a very respectful industry in Israel about the potential business case for a small launch vehicle for specific missions of small satellites. And the answer was yes, of course, we can do it. It's not something that we need many years to do. But then it was started to be addressed by not the politicians, but some decision makers with lack of vision. And they said, well, we have the problem of this and that and so on. And then I was approached again in 2017 to conduct the same research. And I told the people, okay, just look on my previous report. And now the answer is no, we cannot do it because there are more than 100 startups and companies around the world that are addressing the same problem. So the answer for my title for the research was, do a small satellite need a small launcher? And my answer was yes in 2012, and it is yes today, not for all the satellites, of course, but for several of them, for sure. But now there is no advantage to the Israeli know-how and technology because so many actors are now playing on the field. So, so this is the reason why we don't have any small launch vehicle, commercial one, and this is the reason why, for example, there is not a single company in Israel that builds, let's say, 100 units of small satellites per year and selling them online like we all know other companies do.
So, last question from me, and later on we'll open the stage for questions from the audience.
Sure.
Let's talk about vision. 2050, you and I, my friend, sitting together, how the space industry, the Israeli space industry, will look like in 2050?
Well, the fantasy in 2050, we will have this conversation in microgravity. On board the commercial Israeli, Saudi, Emirati space station. Okay, with a Chinese spacecraft on the side.
Okay.
But I'm afraid that the conversation in 2050 might be very similar to the one we have today. Recollection of lost opportunities and lack of vision during the years. I hope to see, like I said, in 2050 for sure, much more, much stronger and independent space agency. The many more space companies in Israel that are able to do much larger things than today, not just this components and subsystems, but let's say, I don't see any Israeli mega constellation of satellites, but perhaps we will see something like that. But a lot more involvement in international mega projects like the James Webb Space Telescope, like let's say a lander on the moons of Saturn, for example. I don't see any reason why Israel won't be part of a mega project in space, and we can do drones to Mars and let's say a UAV for Titan, for example, or landing something that will produce fuel from the methane on other celestial bodies and so on. But it all depends on the vision that at the moment it is hard to imagine that we will see in the near future because of the political issues and situation and the constant struggle for funds within the Israeli space agency. But If I could fantasize a little bit, after we will solve all our political problems here with our neighbors, so in 2050, we could be part of the European Space Agency, for example. And this will be a whole new game for us. And I can keep dreaming about a Middle Eastern a Middle Eastern ESA. Okay.
Yeah, Middle East Space Agency.
Exactly, and you can think about launch site in Saudi Arabia with a launcher built in the UAE, launching satellites built in Israel, or in the King Abdul Aziz City of Science and Technology in Saudi Arabia, for example. So Israel as a hub, as an R&D center, I don't think that we will need forever to build everything here. We can design it here and build it outside on another location. Same applies to military satellites. The US knows how to contract with Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman to build very sophisticated and classified satellites, and we are cooperating with the United States and some parts of our missile defense systems are built in the US. So the same could be done in space to save the cost, and we can launch from the United States. So, but my dream for the Middle East is to have a Middle East space agency. Yeah.
Cool. So, well, we can talk for hours.
Yeah.
But let's open the floor for questions from the audience. Kiara, would you be so kind and let Tal know what questions are interesting?
Yes, of course. We have a couple of nice questions. Actually, adding on to the answer you already gave with an outlook on the future, we have a question from the wonderful Chris, and he asks, for the moon, Israel created Bereshit, and in January 2022 signed the Artemis Accords. What is your vision for the moon and beyond?
Okay, I can remember the signing ceremony for the Artemis Accord because I was the host. So it was very interesting moment in the history of our space agency because you can see from the face of all the presence, either physical or by remote means. And Administrator Nelson spoke very warmly on the Israeli innovation spirit and so on. So Bereshit, as you know, we have another Bereshit coming, the Bereshit 2. But then again, it's a private enterprise. So we might want to do something like this, but with the cooperation of several other countries. And so the moon, of course, what we will do in the framework of the Artemis Accord is yet to be considered by both sides. But the MOU, for example, is very wide. And back in 2011 or 2012, we signed a specific MOU with NASA about the moon. But the issue is not just the vision that we have or we don't have, is the funding. So it's a very critical obstacle at the moment. But I can see several Israeli technologies on the moon, and I have my own ideas that I won't share with you at the moment because some of them I am checking at the moment for the validity of the idea. So,
cool. Next question, Kiara.
Stay tuned.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, the next question we have is from Ilan Hazam. He says, "Hi Tal, top 3 profit topics that Israeli space startups can generate profit from in the next decade." And then he gives some examples of internet, mining, radar, ...
Well, actually, I don't know. The best answer is I don't know. And by the way, for the 2050 timeline, or could be 2040, or even 2030, the best Israeli startup in space is not yet operating at the moment. So new ideas that I cannot think about them might be the most beneficial economically speaking. So I know for many years that a lot of the revenues from space is in the downstream part. And in that regard, if you are speaking about the Israeli capabilities, it could be cyber, it could be AI, it could be machine learning, and so on. We have a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience in other areas, so they could be part of a future space profitable business.
Thanks. Next question, Kiara.
Yes, we're going to do one more question due to the time, but thank you all for sending in your questions. It's really appreciated. So, final question from Elad Lerner. Do you think that the Israeli Space Agency's role is to be closer to NASA's role as an agency that does basic science without looking for profitability, or more like a way to support Israeli startups and other private companies?
Well, in Israel, one of the objectives of the Israeli Space Agency is to support startups and to help them in the first stage. And this is something that is already done for many years, but then again with a small amount of money. But for sure, this is a strategic goal of the Israeli Space Agency to support startups to help new ideas to be materialized. So if a startup is now searching their way to work with NASA or ESA or the UK Space Agency or so, or any other agency, the Israeli Space Agency could be the facilitator for this cooperation and collaboration. And this is already in effect for several years, and it will be much more importance in the years to come, because I know the strategic goals of the new Director General of the Space Agency. He wants to see many more companies in Israel operating in the space arena. So this is not like NASA. And for example, the Space Agency was established in 1983, in January 1983, and the first satellite by the Space Agency was Venus, and Venus was launched in 2017. So it's not like NASA launching a lot of space missions. And we don't have, at the time, 2022, we don't have the, let's say, the plans to become a small NASA and let's say, spreading satellites and space telescope all over the solar system. So we are more focused on Earth at the time. And yes, the Israeli Space Agency, as a governmental organ, was created in part to support newcomers into the space industry.
Kiara, do we have time for another follow-up question?
Yes, I just got the okay from the production team. One more question, which is a very nice follow-up, and it's a question from Dimitri Payson. And he says, what do you think about the public role of the domestic space industry rather than just profit generation? In Israel today, do you think having a national space program could be of a significant influence at the national education, science, and broader self-esteem of the younger generation? Again, in addition to having the large employee and commercial benefits from selling stuff and services to customers.
Well, Dimitri, I got your message earlier, so we'll have a chance to meet and talk much more into it. But encouraging the young generation to embark on the space-related project is, again, part of the Israeli Space Agency activities. Aside from national, let's say, national projects like Bereshit, another astronaut, or something like that, and selling commercial. In addition to having the large employee and commercial benefits for selling, it's a tough question, because the Israeli Space Agency is not the only governmental entity conducting with R&D in technology and science, because we have other ministries like the Ministry of Economics and so on, and the R&D authority. So we want to encourage the next generation of space players in various aspects of becoming involved in space, academics, industry, science, and much more. But we will need more time to discuss it further.
So thank you very much. First of all, Tal, thanks for the time and the knowledge you shared with us and your patience with the questions. Thanks for the audience to join us. And I already want to share with you that the next Israeli Space Cafe will be held on August 23rd. And my guest will be Dr. Hannah Heller, the mother of the high school satellite program. And we will talk about never giving up on your dreams. So again, thank you very much, Tal, and all the guests. And Kiara, back to you.
Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful session and a great way to kick off our Space Café Israel. So before I leave you for today, alongside our next Space Café Israel, we also have another couple of exciting events. So on the 21st of July, we're going to have our next Space Café Italy by the wonderful Dr. Magatti with her guest, Cinzia Safada. And this will, of course, be in Italian. Then on the 8th of August, we'll have our Space Café Brazil by Ian Grossner, who will be talking to Professor Thais Russamano about the future of humans in space in Portuguese. And then on the 11th of August, we'll have our next Space Law Breakfast with Stephen Freeland and his guests, Annie Hanmer and Chris Johnson. And this will be at a different time than usual for our American friends. So it will be at 12:30 p.m. CEST. And then on the 16th of August, Torsten will be back from the summer break with his format of the 33 minutes with. So stay tuned to see who his next guest will be. And on the 17th of August, just a day later, we'll have our next Space Café Austria by the wonderful Judith Delaney, who will be talking to Christian Klösch. All events are going to be online on Eventbrite. And as always, we love to hear from you. So please check in with us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Don't forget to sign up to our daily and bi-weekly newsletters. And if you want to treat yourselves to something special, become a Space Watcher today or help us out in the supporter program. Again, huge thank you to Meidad and to Tal for this very inspiring and insightful talk and for being our guest. And thanks to the entire team behind the scenes for doing this great job week in and week out. I hope that you all stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you so much for joining us and for being so active and engaged in the Q&A and in the chat. I hope to see you in the next weeks. And in the meantime, visit our website, follow us on social media, and don't forget, become a Space Watcher. Thank you.